Back to the Iran talks. Iran's foreign minister says nuclear talks will not wrap up today, as previously reported. The White House press secretary saying just moments ago that major issues remain, but progress has been made in Vienna over the last several days. In the meantime, there is some new criticism from some American lawmakers who fear the U.S. is giving Iran too much leeway.
We have to make very clear that there is a deterrence in the longer term, because if not, in 12, 13 years, we will be exactly back to where we are today, except that Iran will have $150 billion more in its pocket and promoting its terrorism throughout the Middle East.
Senator Menendez, a Democrat there. Joining us now, Jonathan Shanzer, the Vice President of Research at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, and Jim Walsh, international security expert with MIT Security Studies Program. It's great to have you both, as we were waiting to see, will we have a deal by the time we talk? We don't. We're awaiting details, and we'll continue to do so. Jim, you've been one over the last several years that has held out some optimism about this deal, and I'd like to give you the first go, because we heard from Ambassador Bolton, who's very critical of it at the beginning of our show. What, in your mind, does this deal have to make it a success?
Yeah, and I outlined some of that in my my testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's got to have the additional protocol plus. It has to reduce the number of centrifuges. It has to shrink the amount of nuclear material. It has to allow inspectors the ability to do their job with enhanced mandates, better technology. You know, there's some minimum things here. They're like, for me, it's about 16 or 17. But as far as Ambassador Bolton goes, you know, he said that this was historically bad. Of course, we haven't seen the deal yet. Historically bad. These are the same people who said that the interim deal, the so-called joint plan of action, was going to be the worst deal ever, like dealing with Hitler. The sky was going to fall. None of that happened. At every stage, the negotiators have done better than folks thought they were going to do.
It's interesting to note that, Jonathan, the interim deal, at least the one that was the most recent deal, when all parties went back to their sides, Iran came out and said, wait a minute, United States, we didn't agree to any of the specifics that you're telling the public about. And there was obviously either a problem with the translation or somebody didn't have the agreement down. So is that a good model to look at, to say, well, you know, things might stay there? Because Josh Earnest says that interim agreement might just stay in effect for right now.
Well, that may be the case, and we continue to see Treasury extend the sanctions relief one period after another, sometimes a couple of days, sometimes longer. And it just seems like these talks are just going on in a never-endless fashion. And the communication has been bad. And I think, in general, we've got a lot to be concerned about. We've got a lot to worry about in terms of sanctions relief and how that money may go to terrorist organizations. We've got a lot to worry about in terms of the sunset provision. What Iran will be, what will be in its possession at the end of these 10 years. A lot to still be very, very concerned about.
That 10 years has also come up in reports, Jim, over the last 24 hours about whether or not it's going to be 10 years at all. Is that time frame a non-negotiable?
Well, yeah, I think it is, but it also, I think, it's not a very good description of the agreement. There are access to uranium mines for 30 years. Some of the obligations in the agreement will go on forever, like the additional protocol, like the safeguards agreements, like changing that Arak reactor. Once that's changed and that reactor's fired up, it's not going to go back. So some of these things go far beyond 10 years, but I agree we have to think about some of the restrictions as they go off in 10 or 15 years. But I would say about the timing of this, I've heard skeptics sort of try to argue it both ways. When there's progress, they say the U.S. is making concessions. And when there isn't progress, they say the Iranians are playing for time. You know, you can't have it both ways. Well, progress can't be good, and no progress can't be good.
It has been difficult to know, Jim, though, admittedly, hasn't it, about what actually is happening inside these negotiations. We quite frankly, we don't know. But I'd like to go back to that point, Jonathan, that Senator Menendez made about the sanctions relief. Because one of the things that this deal focuses on is, of course, the nuclear program. It doesn't focus on Iran as the #1 state sponsor of terror, what they do necessarily with their money as far as funding different terror operations around the world. We've talked a lot about that. You have experience in the Treasury Department. What about that angle to all of this?
Well, Jenna, in my estimation, this could be the largest windfall for terrorist organizations in modern history. We're talking about a $50 billion cash advance at the beginning of this deal, and then perhaps another 100 or $110 billion after that. And, you know, we continue to hear from the administration that the bulk of this money is going to be invested in schools and hospitals, as if Iran hasn't been a state sponsor of terrorism since its inception in the late 1970s. And so there's a lot of concern here. Even if, for example, 5 or 10% of that money leaks out to terrorist organizations, you're talking about a huge boon to groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen. I could go on.
Well, and I'm curious, Jim, what about that? Let's say the deal is successful.
Yeah.
Let's say there's a great deal. We're happy about it. The public's happy. The administration's
Yes.
happy. Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. But
Yes.
Iran gets relief to its arms embargo. And
Yeah.
Iran does exactly what Jonathan says. It doesn't change its state of current affairs.
Yeah,
Then what?
Well, my answer is, if you don't like Iran engaging in terrorism, you certainly don't want Iran engaging in terrorism that has nuclear weapons. That's obviously a worse outcome. So the core objective, number one objective, is preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
So let's say we do that. Then the current state of Iran, what about that? What leverage does this give us at all then to stop that and the regime that's behind that?
Well, you know, we did arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, and they had 25,000 nuclear weapons pointed at us. We did arms control with Muammar Gaddafi, and no one liked him very much for good reason. So I think you're able to have effective agreements with adversaries, but they're still your adversaries.
Sure.
What you're trying to do is solve a particular problem, and the problem we're solving is nuclear weapons. If we give no sanctions relief, which is the alternative here, there would be no deal. Do you think Iran's going to agree to do everything we ask it to do and get no sanctions?
Well, I'll go back to your point, Jim, that you said we actually don't know what's in the deal.
Yes.
Jonathan,
Yes.
we've heard these criticisms before from those that say this is something that we have to continue to pursue. We've done this with the Soviet Union. We've done this with Muammar Gaddafi. Why do you think this is different?
Well, I mean, look, what we're talking about here is a certain amount of leverage that we had as a result of those sanctions. The sanctions were crippling. They were actually beginning to work with Iran, primarily because of the SWIFT sanctions, the banking sanctions, and other sectors as well. And we had them exactly where we wanted them. It's at that point that we began to loosen our leverage. And so the concern that we have right now is that the more money Iran gets back in its pockets, the less likely it is going to want to comply with whatever agreement has been struck. And so there is that dissonance within this construct, and it's really worth exploring further.
Well, we're glad to explore the topic with both of you, and we'll wait again for the details. And when we do get them, if we do get them, or if we don't get them, we look forward to having you all back. Thank you very much, Jim and Jonathan.
Thank you, Jenna.